There were 14 people in that conference room, and I was the only one who didn't flinch when my mother said it. Well, obviously the house goes to the biological children. Adopted kids don't get inheritance. That's not how this works. She said it like she was correcting someone's math. Calm, certain, like she was doing everyone a favor, clearing up the confusion. Before it got awkward, the lawyer, Diane Forsyth, silver-haired, sharp. She'd represented my grandfather for over 20 years. She set down her pen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look surprised. She just said, "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, that's precisely how this works." A pause. "Would you like me to read the relevant clause again? Or would you like to explain to your daughter why you told her 26 years ago that she was never allowed to know the truth?" You could have heard a pin drop, because here's the thing. My mother had no idea what she'd just walked into. She didn't know what my grandfather had done 4 months before he died. She didn't know what was sitting in that folder in front of Diane. And she definitely didn't know that the woman she just tried to erase from a $6 million estate was about to find out exactly why. She'd always felt like a stranger in her own family. Welcome back to Karma Comes Home. If you're new here, this is where the people who think they got away with it find out they didn't. Stay till the end, because what happened in that room next is the reason this channel exists. My name's Claire. I'm 33. I live outside Portland, Oregon, and for as long as I can remember, I was the odd one out. In my own family, I have 2 brothers, Todd, 2 years older, Ryan, 4 years younger, and growing up, there was always this distance. Not abuse, not neglect exactly, just a coolness, a sense that I was tolerated instead of loved the way they were loved. My mother, Eleanor, ran our household with a kind of precision. Everything had a place, everyone had a role. And mine, I understood this without ever being told, was simple. Be quiet, be helpful, don't ask too many questions, especially about why I looked nothing like anyone else. In our family photos, I have dark hair, green eyes, my mother's blonde. My father, Richard, was blonde too, before he passed, when I was 19. Todd and Ryan both have his exact jawline. I used to joke, as a kid, that I must have gotten the recessive genes. My mother would laugh, a little too quickly, then change the subject. I want you to sit with that, because it matters later. The fact that I made that joke my entire childhood, and nobody, not once, corrected me with the truth. My grandfather, Walter Hensley, he was the one bright spot, warm in a way the rest of my family wasn't. Remembered my birthday without being reminded, came to my dance recitals when my own mother sent my dad instead. He used to call me his favorite surprise. I always thought it was just a sweet, slightly odd thing grandfathers say. I didn't know, until I was 33, standing in a lawyer's conference room, how literal that nickname really was. Walter built a chain of hardware stores, started with one shop in the 70s, sold the business for a significant sum in his 60s. By the time he passed, that spring, at 84, his estate was worth just over $6 million. And 4 months before he died, according to Diane, he called her office and asked for one very specific, very deliberate change to his will. Before I tell you what that change was, you need to understand the story my family told about itself, because this whole episode is watching that story collapse in real time. The official version, the one I grew up inside, never questioning, was this. Eleanor and Richard Whitmore, high school sweethearts, married young, 3 biological children, Todd, then me, then Ryan, a normal, all-American family. My mother said this exact sentence at every gathering I can remember. We've been blessed with 3 wonderful kids of our own. I heard that phrase probably 500 times and never once thought about what it was quietly excluding. Here's what actually happened, pieced together from documents I only saw for the first time in that conference room. When I was 6 months old, my biological mother, A young woman named Danielle, a distant cousin of my father's, was going through addiction, an unstable living situation. She made the impossibly hard decision to give me up. My father's family knew. My father agreed to take me in because he genuinely wanted to. He wanted to raise me as his own. My mother did not want a fourth mouth to feed on someone else's terms, and she especially did not want anyone outside the family to know. In her world, the country club, the church, and her circles, an adopted daughter didn't fit the image, the one she'd built. So they made a decision: raise me as their own, tell no one, just never mention it. Not to me, not to extended family, not even eventually to themselves, I think. My mother got so good at the lie. I sometimes wonder if she genuinely forgot. It was the only person who refused to let the truth stay buried was my grandfather. He knew. He'd always known. And it ate at him, Diane said, watching his daughter treat me like a lesser member of the family without me ever knowing why. He told me, Diane said, reading from her notes, that watching Eleanor slowly, quietly favor Todd and Ryan over the years was one of the hardest things he'd witnessed in his life. His words: "She loves Claire. I know she does. But she loves her like a duty, and the boys like a joy. And Claire has spent her whole life feeling the difference, without ever being told why." I had to leave the room for a few minutes, not because it was news that my mother favored my brothers. I'd known that on some level my whole life. It was news that someone else had seen it too, named it, and cared enough to do something about it. Let me give you a few examples, because favoritism sounds abstract until you hear the small, cumulative moments that make it real. When I was 12, I made the honor roll for the first time. My mother said, "That's nice, sweetie," while unloading groceries, then went back to asking Todd about baseball practice. 2 years later, when Todd made honor roll, his first time, not mine, she took him to his favorite restaurant, told the whole extended family. At Thanksgiving, when I turned 16, I got my mother's old sedan, 90,000 miles, cracked dashboard. When Ryan turned 16, 4 years later, he got a brand new Civic, paid in cash, because safety matters so much for a new driver. I remember sitting in that old sedan, in the driveway, watching Ryan take pictures next to his new car, feeling a specific kind of quiet I didn't have language for yet. None of it, on its own, would prove anything in a courtroom. That's what made it so hard to point to, so easy for my mother to deny, so exhausting to carry. For over 2 decades, I didn't have a smoking gun. I just had 1,000 small moments, all pointing the same direction, and no one willing to say the sentence that connected them. Let's go back to that room, because you deserve the full scene. It was a Tuesday morning in September. Diane Forsyth's office, 14th floor, downtown Portland. In the room, my mother Todd and his wife Ryan, me, and my Aunt Susan, Walter's younger sister, flown in from Arizona, the only extended family member who already knew the whole truth and had been quietly hoping for years that it would come out. Diane started the way these things usually start, reading through the standard provisions. The house in Lake Oswego, split evenly. Investment accounts, split evenly. A vacation property in Bend, going to Todd, since he'd used it most. Nothing dramatic, nothing that raised an eyebrow. Then Diane got to the section on the primary residence, the family home. Walter had lived there 40 years, valued at just under $2 million, on its own. She read a clause specifying it would be divided in equal thirds among my 3 grandchildren, Todd, Claire, and Ryan, without distinction. That phrase, without distinction. My mother laughed, short, dismissive, the kind of laugh she used when she thought someone had made an obvious mistake. Well, obviously the house goes to the biological children. Adopted kids don't get inheritance. That's not how this works. I remember the exact sensation of hearing that sentence. It wasn't shock. Not at first. It was confusion. I didn't understand what she meant by adopted kids. I actually turned to look at Todd, thinking maybe he'd been adopted, and I'd never known. Some other family secret entirely. It took a full 3 seconds for the sentence to reorganize itself in my head and land on the actual correct target. Me. She was talking about me. Diane didn't blink. She'd clearly been braced for this, because Walter, I'd learn later, had warned her it might happen. She set down her pen, quiet, deliberate, somehow louder than shouting. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, that's precisely how this works. Would you like me to read the relevant clause again? Or would you like to explain to your daughter why you told her, 26 years ago, that she was never allowed to know the truth? My mother went white. Actually white. I watched the color drain out of her face, in real time, the way it does in movies, but rarely does in real life. Diane, this isn't the time. Your father specifically anticipated this conversation, Eleanor. He left a letter. To be read in this exact scenario, I'd suggest we get to it now, rather than later. I want to tell you what was in that letter, because it's the single most important document I own. I've read it probably 50 times since that day. Diane opened a sealed envelope, my grandfather's handwriting on the front. For the room, when Eleanor says what I think she's going to say. He'd written it 4 months before he died, sitting in his study, apparently after a phone call with my mother, where she'd made some offhand comment about the kids, drawing a line between Todd, Ryan, and me, without even realizing she was doing it. That was the moment, Diane told us. He decided he couldn't let this go to his grave. Unaddressed. I'm going to paraphrase most of it, but the substance was this. He said that when Richard and Eleanor took me in as an infant, he supported the decision fully. He never once in 33 years saw me as anything other than his granddaughter. Full stop. No qualifier. He said he'd watched, over the decades, small moments accumulate, birthday gifts that were nicer for the boys, college fund contributions that were larger for the boys, offhand comments at family dinners, drawing a line between our kids and Claire, without anyone in the family, including me, ever consciously naming it. He wrote that he'd tried gently several times over the years to talk to Eleanor about it, and each time, she denied doing it at all. Genuinely, sincerely, in a way that told him she'd convinced herself it wasn't happening, and then he wrote the line. The one I think about more than any other line anyone has ever said to me, or about me. He said he'd decided, if nobody else in this family was willing to say it, out loud, in front of everyone, that I belonged exactly as much as my brothers did, then he would make sure a legal document said it for them. Not because money fixes what silence broke, but because some truths need a moment official enough that nobody in the room gets to pretend they didn't hear it. He specified the house be split without distinction because he anticipated this exact meeting, this exact objection. He wanted his own voice from beyond the grave to be the one that corrected it, not because he doubted Diane would enforce the will regardless, but because he wanted my mother to hear it from him one last time, because someone in this family needed to keep proof that Claire's childhood mattered just as much as her brother's. When Diane finished reading, she handed me the folder. It wasn't fancy, just an old, slightly worn folder, but the moment I held it, I knew it was priceless. Inside was my childhood, a crayon drawing I'd made when I was 7. I'd titled it, Grandpa's Hardware Store. There was a 6th grade report card. In the corner, my grandfather had written, "So proud of you, kiddo." There were birthday cards, school projects, little notes I'd forgotten I'd ever written, even a photograph from my college graduation. I don't even remember him taking it. Somehow, he'd quietly kept all of it, for years. By then, I was crying, not because I was sad. Honestly, it felt more like relief, the kind of relief that comes when someone finally proves you weren't imagining it. When your heart has known something for years, and someone finally says, "You were right." That's a strange feeling, beautiful and heartbreaking. At the same time, there's something I don't think enough family stories talk about. Everyone loves the big reveal, the courtroom moment, the shocking secret, but life doesn't stop there. The hardest part is what happens after. My mother didn't react the way I'd hoped. She stood up, picked up her purse, looked around the room, and said, "This is exactly like him. Always the martyr. Always making everyone else look bad so he could be the hero." Then she walked out, right in the middle of reading her own father's will. She left, while I was still sitting there, holding a letter that had just explained 33 years of my life. Todd stayed. He looked completely shaken. After a few minutes, he came over and sat beside me, quietly. "Claire, I swear, I never thought of you differently. I didn't know Mom." Then he stopped talking. I think, for the first time, he realized what he just said. He didn't know, because he never had to know. He'd spent his whole life on the comfortable side of that difference. It's hard to notice a hill when you're walking downhill. Ryan surprised me. He apologized, not because someone told him to, not because he wanted something, a real apology. He looked at me and said, "I always thought Mom was just harder on you, because you were the middle kid." He shook his head. I never even considered there might be another reason. Then he looked down. I should have. That meant more to me than I can explain, not because it fixed anything, but because, for once, someone wasn't trying to argue with my experience. Someone simply believed me. Then Aunt Susan hugged me. For a long time, when she finally let go, she had tears in her eyes. "I've wanted to tell you the truth for more than 10 years. But it wasn't my secret to tell," she said. Carrying that secret had become its own kind of burden. Then she told me something I'd never noticed before. But once she said it, I couldn't unhear it. She said every time my mother introduced the three of us to someone new, there was always the tiniest pause, right before my name. Todd, a beat. Claire, another beat. Ryan, just enough hesitation that something always felt slightly off. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I'd probably been feeling it my whole life, without understanding why. It wasn't in my imagination. It never had been. After that meeting, my mother disappeared from my life. 6 weeks. No phone calls, no texts, nothing. She didn't even ask Todd or Ryan to check on me. Just silence. And somewhere around the 4th week, I realized something. I'd spent my entire childhood living inside one kind of silence, the silence of a secret. Now, I was living inside another, the silence of someone who'd been exposed. Somehow, they felt almost the same. When she finally called, I hoped maybe this was the apology. It wasn't. She wanted me to understand her side. She talked for almost 20 minutes. About how different things were back then, about family reputation, about social expectations, about church, about her own mother's opinions, about appearances, about everything except me. She explained, she justified, she defended, but she never once said the 2 words I'd waited my entire life to hear. I told her I needed more time. I still do, honestly, as I'm recording this. But here's the part of this story you're actually watching for, so let me get to it. My mother didn't just lose an argument. In that conference room, word got out. Not because I told anyone outside the family. I didn't need to. Aunt Susan told my mother's older sister, my great-aunt Marion, who happens to still be very close with several women on my mother's longtime church committee. And my mother's world, the one she'd spent 33 years quietly protecting, is a small one. It runs on the exact kind of reputation she'd been so desperate to preserve back when I was 6 months old. Within about 6 weeks, the story wasn't just a private family wound anymore. It was something people in her social circle knew, in that vague, half-detailed way these things travel. Did you hear what Eleanor said at her father's will reading? Enough that people started asking questions. Enough that my mother started noticing. The asking. She'd been, for almost 4 years, working her way toward chairing the Spring Gala Committee at her church, a position she cared about enormously. 2 months after the will reading, she was passed over for it. Nobody said why, officially, but my great-aunt Marion told Susan, who told me that one committee member had said, almost in passing, "I just don't know if Eleanor's the right face for this right now." The exact currency she'd spent 33 years protecting, appearances, reputation, what people thought, was the thing that started slipping out of her hands without me lifting a finger. I want to be really clear about something, because it's easy to hear $6 million inheritance and assume this story is about money. It isn't, not really, and that's the part that surprises people most when I tell it. My third of that house, once we sold it, came out to a little over $600,000. It's life-changing money. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Paid off my student loans, put a real down payment on a house of my own for the first time, gave my husband and me breathing room we'd never had. But if you'd offered me that money in exchange for never getting that letter, never hearing my grandfather's voice, even secondhand, through Diane reading his words out loud, telling an entire room full of people that I belonged, exactly as much as anyone else in that family, I would have said no in a heartbeat. The house was never really the inheritance. The inheritance was watching someone finally, publicly, undeniably, choose me, out loud, on the record, in front of the one person who'd spent 33 years making sure that never happened. I think about something Diane said to me privately after everyone else had left the office that day. She told me she'd handled hundreds of estate readings in her career, most of them unremarkable, polite, businesslike, occasionally a little tense over who got grandma's china cabinet. She said she'd never once had a client plan a moment with the level of care my grandfather put into that letter. He didn't just want to leave you money, she said. He wanted to make sure that if nobody else in that room was going to say it, at least one voice would. He timed it so you'd never have to wonder again. That's what karma actually looks like, most of the time. It's rarely about the money changing hands. It's about the truth finally having nowhere left to hide. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with a moment like that too. Getting proof that you were right, that the coldness you felt as a kid wasn't in your head, doesn't just feel like validation. It also feels like losing something, the hope that you'd simply misread things. I think that's part of why I cried in that room. It wasn't just relief, it was grief. For the version of my childhood I'd quietly hoped I'd misunderstood. It's been about 8 months since that meeting. Here's where everyone landed. Todd and I are actually closer now than we were before any of this happened. I think the discomfort he felt that day genuinely shifted something in him. He's made a real effort since. Flew out for my daughter's second birthday last month, which he'd never once done before. Ryan and I talk every week now. He's become, unexpectedly, one of the people I'm closest to in my entire family, and I think some of that is guilt turning into genuine effort, which I'll take. My mother and I have what I'd call a fragile, formal relationship, but I want to tell you about the one moment in the last 8 months that actually felt like closure, because I think it's the real ending to this story. It happened at Easter, the whole family together for the first time. Since the will reading, my mother, Todd, and his wife, Ryan, Aunt Susan, a handful of cousins, and my mother, out of what I can only assume was old habit, introduced the three of us to a cousin's new boyfriend, the exact way she always had. These are my kids, Todd and Ryan and Claire. That half-second pause Susan had told me about, still there, even after everything, except this time, Todd heard it too. And Todd, who 6 months earlier could barely meet my eyes after the will reading, put his hand on my shoulder, in front of the cousin, in front of everyone. Claire's my sister, not and Claire. My sister. Quiet. Not a scene, but loud enough that the whole table went still, for a second, the same way that conference room had gone still. For Diane. My mother didn't say anything. She just looked at her plate, but I watched something happen on her face I'd genuinely never seen before in 33 years. She looked for the first time in my entire life, like she understood something, that the room was no longer going to quietly go along with the version of our family she'd built. Todd told me afterward he'd been waiting for a chance to say it. Since the day of the will reading, Easter dinner was just the first time. The words showed up before he could stop them. That's the closure I actually got, not an apology from my mother. I still haven't gotten one, and I've stopped waiting for it. What I got was watching the family she spent 33 years curating start on its own, correcting itself around her. I don't know if we'll ever get to a place where the wound between us fully closes, But I've made peace with the fact that the correction didn't have to come from her to still count. I found my biological mother, Danielle, about 4 months ago. That's actually a story for another episode. A complicated, ongoing one I'm not ready to tell in full yet. But I'll say this much. She cried on the phone when I told her. My grandfather had made sure I always knew I mattered, even in a family that struggled to say it out loud. And every year, on the anniversary of his passing, I go visit Walter Hensley's grave. I bring the same thing every time, a small toy hardware truck, the same brand his very first store used to sell, because it makes me laugh. Every single time, and I think it would have made him laugh too. I've also started something new this year. I haven't told many people about it. I opened a small savings account for my daughter. Every month I put a little into it, not a huge amount, just what we can manage, and I named the account after him. It's not about the money, obviously, given how small the contributions are compared to what I inherited. It's about making sure that somewhere, in some quiet, ongoing way, his name keeps showing up in our family story instead of fading into the background, the way so much of my own childhood almost did. I want my daughter to grow up knowing there was a great-grandfather who cared enough, near the very end of his life, to make absolutely sure the truth got said out loud. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Karma doesn't always show up as one dramatic moment. Sometimes it's a slow unraveling. A lawyer correcting you in front of your family, a committee quietly passing you over, your own son finishing the sentence you never had the courage to finish yourself. None of it loud, all of it permanent. My grandfather didn't leave me money because he felt sorry for me. He left me a paper trail of the truth, timed perfectly to land in the one room where my mother couldn't pretend it away. And once it landed, it kept moving, without either of us controlling it. That's the part she never saw coming. She spent 33 years managing exactly what people knew about our family. The one thing she couldn't manage was what happened after they finally knew. That's karma coming home. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever found out a hidden truth about your own family? How did it change things? And if you're new here, hit subscribe. Because next week I'm telling the story of what happened when I finally met my biological mother in person for the first time. And trust me, that reunion did not go the way either of us expected. Until next time, I'm signing off from Karma Comes Home. See you soon. And remember, the truth doesn't always come home loud. Sometimes it just walks in quietly, sits down at the table, and refuses to leave until everyone finally hears it.